In the brilliant sunshine of a modern-day Manitoba springtime, the colorful past of prairie York boats, steamboats, and diesels has almost faded away, washed by a sparkle of foam lost in the wake of a river torrent. For more than a century, the inland waterways of Manitoba were the lifeblood of a major transportation industry. Boats and fortunes were made and lost in an unpredictable northern climate that barely allowed half a year of unfrozen water to float on. It's hard to remember now, in this day of highways, rail, and air routes, that for all those decades, the only freight and public transportation in the north was by the boats that plied its rivers and lakes. Though today that industry has all but disappeared, the Marine Museum in Selkirk is building a treasure house devoted to a fascinating chapter in Manitoba history. Aboard the boats of the Marine Museum, at their final anchor at last, surrounded by lawns now instead of waves, every visitor on every trip can find something new to bring that past to life once again. The Kenora, the Bradbury, the Peguis, the Chicama. For some it means rediscovering old memories and an experience shared. For others, it's the magic of imagination, the best opportunity for learning there can be. They were all steamboats in the early days, burning wood to heat the huge boilers that supplied steam to the chugging pistons, which in turn drove the paddle wheels and later propellers. Northerners paid for their isolation tree by tree. A forest of trees to feed the flames, 60 cords of birch a week for one of the big boats like the Kenora, traveling a route that would begin on a Monday in Selkirk, then on to Hecla, Gull Harbor, Pine Dock, Matheson Island, Barons River, Warren's Landing, across the lake to Grand Rapids, returning down to Barons, into Matheson, Gull Harbor, and Hecla again, sometimes across to Victoria Beach or to Gimli, then into Winnipeg for a Sunday cruise on the river before returning home. 120 tons of logs a season went up the Kenora's stacks in billows of smoke that advertised her coming from miles away. And whole communities would be waiting in celebration at the shore when she would arrive on her first trip in the springtime. For with no roads or rails, there would have been no fresh fruit or vegetables for over 6 months, no mail, nor news of the outside world. But with the return of the boats might appear almost anything. One of the old deckhands remembers a fancy Lincoln automobile brought on board. Fresh groceries, sewing fabric, livestock, building supplies, ice cream, and of course, the tourists, even in the early days, perhaps from far-off New York or Texas. The Kenora outlived them all. Prefabricated in Quebec, the pieces assembled in Kenora, Ontario in 1897, she was later brought west to Winnipeg in sections, where 40 feet more length was added, and she served for a time as a floating dance hall. At 150 feet long, she continued to adapt to changing times, as increased northern development inspired her owners to tear out passenger cabins to make way for more cargo. She burned wood for steam right through to the 1950s, when for a brief period the boilers were converted to use coal. Finally, diesel engines took their place. Within a year, the last smokestacks on Lake Winnipeg were gone for good. By that time, the competition between transport by water and travel by land and air was over, and the boats had lost the race. And time for the Kenora was running out. 5 years after her diesel engines went in, she was retired to a Selkirk slough. It was through the efforts of a dedicated group of men and women that she was restored to service as a museum, committed to preserving the history of prairie boating and the people who had lived it. Other boats had not fared as well as the Kenora. All that's left of the granite rock today are a few fragments salvaged from a rotting wreck. Once one of the most familiar sights on Lake Winnipeg, her dark green hull trimmed in red, black coal smoke blowing from her funnel, towing her lumber barge day in and day out for the Brown and Rutherford Company, she avoided the Lake Winnipeg reefs for over 50 years. It was the shifting sands of a declining economy that did her in. The Bradbury began as a government ship in 1915. For a short time, she was owned by a Winnipeg businessman, but after lying idle for 17 years, from 1935 to 1952, she was recommissioned by the federal government and continued with her official duties until 1973, entertaining dignitaries, delivering treaty payments, acting as a lighthouse tender, setting out buoys and markers, and carrying pickerel and whitefish spawn, stocking the lake for the commercial fishing industry. An unusual element in her construction was a wrought iron hull, fastened with rivets due to difficulties in welding. Outside that, a tough, resilient layer of rock elm equipped her for her other official job as icebreaker. Her history records numerous accounts of valor and distinction. In 1917, she broke through half a foot of ice while carrying doctors and medicine to a settlement which had been struck by a flu epidemic.